It was a night I will never forget, no matter how much I try. Every time it rains, the memory comes rushing back, chilling me to the bone. I was driving home after visiting my sister in the next town over. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the rain had been pouring down in sheets for hours. The windshield wipers barely kept up, smearing the water across the glass like a hopeless effort to clear my vision. The stretch of road I was on cut through a dense forest. It was one of those rural highways with no street lights, and the trees loomed close, their branches clawing at the sky. The sound of rain hammering against the car roof, combined with the occasional flash of lightning, made the world outside feel surreal, almost disconnected. I remember turning the radio down. White noise and static had replaced the music once I got far enough from the last town. That's when I first noticed something strange. It wasn't much at first, just a faint light flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it was another car. I even slowed down, thinking maybe someone was pulled over or stuck. But as I got closer, the light seemed off. It wasn't headlights. It wasn't the yellowish glow of a flashlight either. It was pale, like a lantern but colder, more otherworldly. Against my better judgment, I slowed my car to a near crawl, trying to get a better look. It was coming from deeper in the woods, far from the road. Then I saw her. She was standing just off the shoulder, right where the gravel met the edge of the forest. A woman, drenched from head to toe, wearing a long tattered dress that clung to her body. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her head was tilted slightly downward, though I could still see her eyes beneath the curtain of wet strands. They didn't look right. Empty, like she was staring straight through me. I rolled down the window just a crack, enough to call out to her. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. She didn't even move. A flash of lightning illuminated her for a split second, and I swear I saw something wrong with her skin. It looked grayish, like it had been waterlogged for days. And her hands, they were hanging limply by her sides, but her fingers were unnaturally long and crooked, almost claw-like. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep driving, to floor it and not look back. But something about her felt wrong, like she wasn't just a person standing there. She was waiting. I pressed the gas pedal, trying to move past, and as I did, I heard a soft thud against the side of my car. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her lying on the road, but she wasn't there. Instead, she was standing in the middle of the road behind me, perfectly still, her head now fully raised. Her mouth was moving, though no sound came out. I panicked. Slamming my foot on the accelerator, I sped down the road, the rain blurring everything around me. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just out of sight, watching. The forest seemed endless, and the rain only got heavier. That's when my headlights caught something ahead. Another figure standing in the middle of the road. It was her. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. None. I swerved to avoid her, my tires skidding on the slick pavement. The car spun out of control and veered off the road, slamming into a tree. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I was mostly okay. Shaking, I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The engine was dead. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping on the passenger side window. My breath caught as I slowly turned to look. She was there, her face pressed against the glass. Her mouth was still moving, forming words I couldn't hear, and her hands, those awful twisted hands, were leaving wet smears on the window. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call for help, but of course there was no signal. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rain and my own ragged breathing. I dared to look back at the window, but she was gone. My relief was short-lived. From the corner of my eye, I saw her again, this time standing in front of the car, illuminated by the faint glow of the emergency lights. She raised one hand and pointed directly at me. Then I heard a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear as day, cutting through the pounding rain. It said, "Come back." I shook my head, whispering to myself, "No, no, no," over and over. The door locks clicked. I hadn't touched them. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Come back." Something wet brushed against my neck. I screamed, throwing myself out of the car and into the downpour. I didn't care about the rain or the darkness anymore. I just ran. The woods were a blur as I stumbled through the mud, my feet slipping and sliding. I could hear her behind me, the wet squelch of her footsteps, and that whisper, now louder, echoing in my ears. "Come back. You promised." Promised? I didn't know what she was talking about. I didn't even know her. Eventually, I saw a light in the distance. Real light, warm and golden. It was a gas station. I practically fell through the door, babbling incoherently to the clerk about what had happened. He gave me a strange look and asked, "You were on the old highway, weren't you?" I nodded, still shaking. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not the first. That stretch of road's got a history. Some folks say it's haunted. A woman drowned there decades ago. Her car went off the road during a storm, kind of like yours. They never found her body, just the wreckage. Some say she's still looking for it, trying to drag others back with her." I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. Even now, years later, I can't drive in the rain without feeling like she's watching me, waiting for me to come back to that road.
Story number 2.
It started with the storm. The kind of storm that drowns the world in darkness, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person left alive. I was alone in my apartment, a cheap little place on the edge of town where the power flickers if you so much as sneeze near the breaker. That night, it was more than flickering. A full-blown blackout struck just after 10 p.m., leaving me with nothing but my phone for light. The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I was scrolling through social media, trying to ignore the creeping unease that comes with being plunged into total darkness, when I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, almost like the rain was mimicking the sound of knuckles rapping against wood. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 distinct knocks on the door. I froze. My apartment building wasn't the kind of place where people just dropped by unannounced, especially not during a storm like this. The hallway outside my door was long and narrow, lined with flickering emergency lights that made everything look sickly and surreal. I got up, hesitated for a moment, and then checked the peephole. There was no one there. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the frame of the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. No answer. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. Rain blew in, cold and sharp, but the hallway was empty. That's when I noticed something on the floor, a small, waterlogged package wrapped in brown paper. It had no address, no name, nothing to indicate where it came from. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when the lights came back on. The hallway was bathed in a harsh yellow glow, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the far end, near the staircase. A tall figure, shadowed but unmistakably human, just standing there, staring at me. Then the lights flickered again, and they were gone. I shut the door quickly, bolting it this time. The package felt unnervingly heavy in my hands, and the paper was damp, leaving a faintly reddish stain on my fingers. I set it on the coffee table and just stared at it. I didn't want to open it, but something about it demanded my attention. It was like it was waiting for me. Finally, with shaking hands, I tore the paper away. Inside was an old leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, and the pages smelled faintly of mildew. I opened it. The first page was blank, but as I flipped through, I began to see words scrawled in a frantic, messy handwriting. They didn't make sense at first, just fragments of sentences and disjointed phrases. "It follows me everywhere. The rain keeps it hidden. Don't open the door at night." The further I read, the more incoherent the writing became until it was just scribbles and smudges of what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Then I got to the last page. There was only one line written in bold, angry strokes. "It's already inside." I heard the knock again, this time coming from the window. My stomach dropped. I live on the 3rd floor. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The blinds were down, but I could see the faint outline of something pressed against them. Something that wasn't human. The shape was all wrong. Too tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then a voice came. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it spoke in a low, guttural whisper that made my skin crawl. "Let me in. I'm cold." I backed away, clutching the notebook to my chest like it could protect me. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the rain, its relentless drumming against the window panes. I dared to hope that whatever it was had gone. Then the lights went out again, plunging the room into total darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually I heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard behind me. It was inside. I ran, stumbling over furniture in the pitch black, until I reached the bathroom. I locked the door and crouched in the corner, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like moving through the apartment with an eerie calmness. They stopped just outside the bathroom door, and then it started to speak again, that horrible, rasping whisper. You opened the door. You shouldn't have opened the door. The doorknob rattled. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on and everything went silent. When I finally worked up the courage to open the bathroom door, the apartment was empty. The notebook was gone. I moved out the next day. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know, but every time it rains, I can still hear the faint echo of those knocks. And I'll never ever answer the door again.
Story number 3.
The rain was relentless that night, drumming against the roof like an uninvited guest that wouldn't leave. I had just finished a long shift at the diner and was exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than collapsing into bed. The drive home through the countryside was treacherous, with water pooling on the cracked asphalt and fog rolling in thick waves across the fields. I didn't see the hitchhiker at first. It was only when my headlights caught the flash of a rain-soaked jacket that I noticed him standing by the side of the road. He was hunched over, his back to me, his thumb raised half-heartedly. Normally, I wouldn't stop. Too many horror stories about people who pick up strangers on lonely roads, but something about him made me hesitate. He wasn't moving, not even shivering in the freezing rain. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the window just a crack. "Need a ride?" I called out. He turned slowly, almost unnaturally so, and for a moment I regretted stopping. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, they didn't look right. They were wide and glassy, as though he was looking at something far away, something I couldn't see. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and hollow. He climbed into the passenger seat without waiting for me to say anything else. As he settled in, I noticed that his clothes were oddly dry, considering the downpour outside. The air inside the car seemed to grow colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just keep driving," he said. I didn't argue. The road stretched on, the rain turning the world into a blur of shadows and flickering reflections. The hitchhiker didn't say another word, and the silence between us grew heavier with each passing mile. Every now and then, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring straight ahead, his hands resting in his lap, but there was something wrong with the way he sat, too still, too rigid, like he wasn't entirely comfortable in his own skin. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to break the tension. He turned to me then, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His smile was small and strained, as though it didn't belong on his face. "You could say that," he replied. The road ahead was dark, the kind of dark that swallows light whole. My headlights barely pierced the blackness, and I felt a growing unease, as though we weren't alone out there. Then I saw it. Something darted across the road just ahead of us. At first I thought it was a deer, but it moved too quickly, too unnaturally. Its limbs were long and gangly, and its head snapped toward us for just a moment before disappearing into the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. The hitchhiker didn't answer. I glanced at him and my heart nearly stopped. He was no longer sitting in the seat. Instead, he was staring at me from the rearview mirror, his head tilted at an impossible angle, his eyes black as coal. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice distorted and echoing in the confined space of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the rain-slick road. When I turned around, the passenger seat was empty. The rain had stopped and the world outside was eerily silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Finally, I mustered the courage to step out of the car. The road was empty, but the asphalt glistened with fresh rainwater. I looked around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker or the thing I'd seen in the woods. That's when I noticed the footprints. They led away from the car, a series of long, narrow prints that didn't look human. They disappeared into the forest where the trees seemed to close in like a wall of shadows. I got back in the car and drove away as fast as I could, not caring about the slick roads or the dense fog. When I finally got home, I locked the doors and windows and spent the rest of the night staring at the rain-soaked driveway, half expecting to see him standing there. I haven't taken that road since, and I never will again. But sometimes late at night when the rain is falling and the wind howls through the trees, I hear it, a faint knock on the window and a voice whispering, "You shouldn't have stopped."
Story number 4.
The storm came out of nowhere, the kind that makes the power go out and leaves you fumbling in the dark. I was staying at my grandfather's old farmhouse that night, a rickety place deep in the woods. It was supposed to be temporary, a week to help clean the place out after he passed, but the isolation was already getting to me. That night, the rain came down in sheets, and the wind rattled the loose windows like an intruder trying to break in. The only light came from a single flashlight I'd found in a drawer, its beam weak and flickering. I was sorting through a pile of my grandfather's old things when I found it. A small wooden box, weathered and scratched, with no lock but a strange symbol carved into the lid. I didn't recognize the symbol, but it made me uneasy. A jagged circle with what looked like claw marks slashing through it. Inside the box was an old key, tarnished and cold to the touch. Beneath the key was a folded piece of paper. "Don't open it. Don't use the key." That was all it said, written in shaky handwriting that looked nothing like my grandfather's. A crash of thunder startled me, and the lights flickered for a moment before plunging the house into complete darkness. Great. I grabbed the flashlight, its weak beam casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, almost like it was alive. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from somewhere upstairs. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The house was supposed to be empty. I had checked every room when I arrived. But the sound continued, soft and deliberate, like nails being dragged across wood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I told myself it was just the wind, that old houses make noises, but the scraping grew louder, more insistent. Against every ounce of common sense, I crept upstairs, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. The sound was coming from the attic door, a small, heavy hatch in the ceiling at the end of the hallway. The key in the box. It was the only thing I could think about as I stared at the attic door. It didn't make sense, but I knew the key belonged to that hatch. I should have turned around and left the house right then. Instead, I went back downstairs, grabbed the key, and returned to the attic door. The moment the key touched the lock, the scraping stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. Thick, suffocating silence. And then the door opened on its own, creaking loudly as it swung upward. The air that rushed out was cold and smelled of damp earth and rot. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely penetrating the black void of the attic. "Grandpa?" I whispered, though I didn't know why. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved, a figure, hunched and angular, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, glinting in the darkness. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The thing crawled toward the edge of the attic opening, its movements jerky and inhuman. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Leave," it hissed, its voice a mix of rage and anguish. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran down the stairs, out of the house, and into the pouring rain. My car was parked at the edge of the driveway, but as I reached it, I glanced back. The attic window was open, and the figure was there, watching me. Its long, bony fingers gripped the edge of the window frame, and its glowing eyes followed my every move. I drove through the storm, not stopping until I reached the next town. The next day, I called a local cleanup crew and told them to take care of the house. I didn't want to go back, not even for my things. I don't know what I let out that night, but sometimes when the storms are at their worst, I feel like it's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to find me again.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a quick trip, a weekend getaway to a cabin my friends and I had rented deep in the Appalachian Mountains. A place to disconnect from the world, relax, and share a few laughs. The first night was perfect. We grilled outside, told ghost stories around the fire, and laughed at how ridiculous we all sounded trying to scare one another. By the time the rain started, we were already settled inside the cozy cabin, sipping hot cocoa and watching the storm through the big bay window. Around midnight, the rain grew heavier, pounding against the roof like it was trying to break through. The wind howled, and the lights flickered before going out completely. "Great," Jake groaned, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. "It's part of the experience," Sarah joked, though her smile faltered when we all realized there was no cell service either. We lit some candles and tried to keep the mood light, playing cards and telling more stories. But something felt off. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the silence between gusts of wind. a silence so deep it pressed against my ears. Then we heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the window. We all turned to look. The rain made it hard to see outside, but there was something there, a shadow pressed against the glass. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, grabbing one of the candles and walking toward the window. "Don't!" Sarah hissed, but it was too late. Jake held the candle close to the glass, and for a moment, we saw it clearly. A face, pale and distorted, its features pressed flat against the pane. Its eyes were empty, black holes, and its mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. The candle flickered, and the face vanished. Jake stumbled back, nearly dropping the candle. "Did you see that?" he stammered, his voice shaking. None of us answered. We were too scared to move. The tapping started again, this time from the back door. "No," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. We all turned toward the sound, and that's when we heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from somewhere outside. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from window to window, as though whatever it was circling the cabin, searching for a way in. Searching for a way in. "Lock the doors," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. Jake and I ran to the doors, checking the locks and pushing furniture in front of them. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the woods like it was coming from everywhere at once. Then the power came back on. The lights flickered to life, and the room was suddenly bright and warm, a stark contrast to the terror that had gripped us moments before. But the relief was short-lived. One by one, the candles blew out, even though there was no breeze. And then we saw it. Standing in the corner of the room was the figure from the window. Its body was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, bending in ways they shouldn't. Its face was the same pale, twisted mask, and its empty eyes seemed to bore into each of us. "Why did you invite me in?" It rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "We didn't," Jake started, but the thing cut him off with a horrible, choking laugh. "You opened the door?" it said, stepping closer. Jake and Sarah screamed, and I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, swinging it wildly. But the thing didn't flinch. It just kept coming, its grin growing wider, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. The lights flickered again, and for a moment everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. The room was silent except for the sound of our ragged breathing. "Did that just happen?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the tapping started again. But this time it was coming from inside the cabin.
Story number 6.
I was driving back to my parents' house late one rainy night, the kind of night where the rain turns the road into a mirror and the headlights feel like they barely pierce the darkness. The trip was familiar. I'd driven it 100 times before. But that night, something felt different. The air was heavy, and an eerie fog clung to the ground, swirling like smoke with every gust of wind. I was about 20 minutes from home when I saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone caught in the storm, their clothes soaked through, their posture slumped with fatigue. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't move, not even a flinch as my car approached, the headlights illuminating them. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her long hair hung over her face, and her arms dangled at her sides, limp and unnatural. Her dress was old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photograph, and it clung to her body as if it had been soaked for days. I slowed down, instinctively feeling a knot of dread in my stomach. She stood there, staring at me. Or so I thought, though I couldn't see her eyes. Against my better judgment, I stopped the car and rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. The rain poured harder, and I was about to drive off when she slowly lifted her arm and pointed down the road. What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. She didn't speak. She just kept pointing, her finger trembling slightly. A car horn blared behind me, snapping me out of my daze. Startled, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but rain and darkness. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. I slammed the window shut and pressed the gas, my tires skidding slightly on the wet road. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the storm and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But then I saw the car. It was off the road, half hidden in a ditch. The headlights were dim, but they cast just enough light to reveal the crumpled hood and shattered windshield. My stomach turned as I pulled over. The car looked old, at least a few decades out of place, with rusted edges and a license plate that was barely legible. I grabbed my phone, its dim glow barely comforting, and got out of the car. The rain was icy, soaking through my jacket within seconds. "Hello?" I called out, stepping closer to the wreckage. There was no response. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger side door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, the car looked untouched, as if no one had been there in years. But the strangest thing was the smell, not gasoline or oil, but something metallic, sharp, and sickly sweet. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. "Help me." The voice was coming from the woods. Every instinct told me to leave, to get back in my car and drive as far as I could, but something, curiosity, guilt, or maybe sheer stupidity, drew me toward the sound. I stepped off the road, the beam of my phone's flashlight barely cutting through the fog. The trees were skeletal, their branches reaching out like claws. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." I followed the sound deeper into the woods, my shoes sinking into the muddy ground. The rain muffled everything, and I felt utterly alone, surrounded by an endless sea of shadows. Then I saw her. The woman from the road was standing ahead of me, her back turned, her dress clinging to her in the downpour. I froze. She slowly turned, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice dripping with malice. Before I could move, she lunged toward me, her hands outstretched. Her fingers were like claws, cold and sharp as they grazed my arm. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The light went out, leaving me in total darkness. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The laughter followed me, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. When I finally reached the road, I didn't look back. I jumped into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the wheels skidding on the slick pavement. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the road. But there was nothing, or so I thought. When I got home, soaked and trembling, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a small, damp patch as though someone had been sitting there, and on the fogged-up window, written in dripping, jagged letters, were 2 words, "Thank you."
Story number 7.
It happened during the kind of storm that makes you question why you left the house in the first place. The rain was relentless, and the wind whipped the trees into a frenzy. I was heading home from a late-night shift, taking a back road through an old forested area to save time. The road was poorly lit and riddled with potholes, but I'd driven it before. That night, though, it felt different. The storm seemed to drown out every sound except the drumming of rain on my windshield, and the world beyond my headlights was a swirling void of shadows and water. About 10 minutes into the drive, I saw something in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was just debris blown in by the wind, a branch maybe, or trash. But as I got closer, I realized it was a suitcase. I slowed to a stop, my car idling as I stared at it. It was an old, battered thing, its leather exterior darkened by the rain. Against my better judgment, I got out, my raincoat doing little to shield me from the downpour. The suitcase was heavy, too heavy for its size. I hesitated, glancing around. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, the trees swaying violently. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no other cars, no houses, just me, the storm, and the suitcase. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and flipped open the latches, my heart pounding. Inside was a bundle of cloth, soaked through and reeking of mildew. I pushed it aside and my stomach turned. It wasn't cloth at all. It was a dress, tattered and stained with something dark. And underneath it, nestled in the corner of the suitcase, was a small porcelain doll. The doll's face was cracked, its glass eyes staring up at me with an unsettling intensity. Its mouth was painted in a crooked smile, and its tiny hands were clasped together, as if in prayer. I stumbled back, the suitcase falling closed with a heavy thud. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle, carried on the wind. I spun around, scanning the road and the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the rain and the rustling of leaves. My first instinct was to leave the suitcase and get out of there, but something about it felt wrong, like leaving it would somehow make things worse. I tossed it into the trunk of my car, slammed it shut, and got back behind the wheel. The drive home was tense. The rain seemed louder now, hammering against the roof as if trying to get in. The radio crackled with static, and every so often I thought I saw something moving in the rearview mirror. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was shaking. I didn't bring the suitcase inside. I couldn't. Instead, I left it in the trunk and locked the car, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound, a faint tapping at my window. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but the tapping was too deliberate. I got out of bed and pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there. Relieved, I turned back toward the bed. That's when I saw it. The doll was sitting on my nightstand. Its cracked face was tilted toward me, and its tiny hands were no longer clasped. They were spread open, reaching toward me. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The noise woke up my roommate, who came running into the room. But by the time she got there, the doll was gone. The next morning, I went to check the car. The suitcase was still in the trunk, but it was empty. I threw it into the dumpster down the street and tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream. But the giggling hasn't stopped. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Soft, high-pitched laughter echoing through the house, and no matter where I go, I always feel like I'm being watched.
Story number 8.
I was working late at the diner that night, the kind of greasy all-night spot where truckers stop for coffee and teenagers hang out because there's nowhere else to go. The rain outside was relentless, hammering against the windows and pooling in the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The fluorescent lights flickered every now and then, and the hum of the neon sign was the only sound besides the storm and the occasional clink of dishes. Around 2 a.m., the place was almost empty. Just me, the cook in the back, and a lone man sitting at the counter nursing a cup of coffee. That's when the door swung open. A woman stepped inside, drenched from head to toe. Her hair clung to her face, and her clothes looked like they belonged to another era. A long dress, pale and tattered like something from an old photograph. She didn't say a word as she walked to the farthest booth and sat down. "Rough night?" I asked, grabbing a menu to bring over to her. She didn't answer. She just stared out the window, her back to me. "Can I get you something?" I tried again, my voice uncertain. Without turning around, she said, "Coffee. Black." Her voice was soft but cold, like it carried no warmth at all. I nodded and poured a cup, bringing it to her table. When I set it down, she finally turned to look at me. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes, there was something wrong with them. They were too dark, like twin voids that seemed to pull in all the light around them. I forced a smile and stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything else." She didn't respond. I went back behind the counter, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The man at the counter glanced at me, his expression grim. "You know her?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I said. "She just came in." He frowned, looking back toward her booth. "She doesn't look right." I wanted to brush it off, but he was right. Something about her wasn't normal. Then the lights flickered again, this time staying off for a few seconds before buzzing back to life. When they came back on, the booth was empty. The coffee cup sat untouched, a thin wisp of steam curling up from the surface. I looked around, but there was no sign of her. The door hadn't opened, and the storm outside was as fierce as ever. "She's gone," the man muttered, standing up and throwing a few bills on the counter. "I'm getting out of here." Before I could say anything, he was gone, leaving me alone in the diner. I told myself she must have slipped out when the lights went out, even though it didn't make sense. I cleaned up the cup and went about closing up for the night. But as I wiped down the counter, I noticed something. The stool where the man had been sitting was damp, as if someone had been dripping water onto it. And then I saw it, a single wet footprint on the floor, leading toward the back door. I followed the trail, my heart pounding. It led to the supply closet, the door slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The closet was empty, just shelves of cleaning supplies and spare napkins. But on the wall, scratched deep into the plaster, were 3 words: "Don't look back." A cold chill ran down my spine. I turned around, and there she was, standing just inches from me. Her face was inches from mine, her eyes like black holes, and her mouth twisted into a hideous grin. "You shouldn't have followed," she whispered. The lights went out again, plunging me into darkness. When they came back on, I was alone. I locked up the diner and left without finishing my shift. But now, every time it rains, I see her. In reflections in windows, sometimes even in the corner of my eye. She's always there, watching, waiting.